He sat there like the outcome had already been decided. Relaxed, comfortable, almost amused. Jeffrey Epstein leaned slightly toward his attorney, whispering something that made them both smile. Not a nervous smile. Not a hopeful one. It was the kind of smile that comes from certainty, the certainty of a man who believed the rules had never applied to him and never would. Around him, the courtroom waited. Papers rustled. A pen tapped. But he didn't look worried. He looked untouchable. This man believed no judge in America could ever touch him. Not because he was innocent. Not because the facts were on his side. But because, for most of his life, power had always arrived before consequences. Doors opened. Questions disappeared. Problems dissolved quietly. And as he sat there, calm and confident, he believed this would be no different. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that this hearing was already over in one crucial way. Not because of a dramatic outburst. Not because of a surprise witness. But because of one small detail that had already caught the attention of Judge Judy. A detail so ordinary it seemed harmless. A detail most people would have ignored. And that single detail was about to unravel everything he thought protected him. Because before this hearing ended, everything shielding him, money, influence, reputation, was going to collapse in front of everyone. For years, Epstein had lived inside a world where consequences moved slower for people like him. He understood leverage. He understood silence. He understood how systems bend when enough wealth presses against them. And that understanding had shaped the way he carried himself into this courtroom. He didn't scan the room for threats. He didn't study the judge. He acted as if the verdict was a formality, an obstacle to be managed, not a danger to be feared. That confidence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in his posture. In the way he leaned back in his chair. In the way he let his lawyer do the talking as if the details were beneath him. To Epstein, this wasn't a reckoning. It was just another room, another authority figure, another situation he believed could be navigated the same way all the others had been. But Judge Judy was watching, not reacting, not interrupting, not signaling anything at all. She let him sit in that confidence. She let him talk. She let him believe he was in control. And while the room focused on his status, his name, his past, she focused on something much smaller. Something quieter. Something that didn't belong. That's the part most people miss about real power. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. If you believe no amount of money should place someone above the law, stay with me, and hit like, because this story only gets heavier from here. Because this wasn't the beginning of Epstein's defense. It was the end of his illusion. And the moment he finally realized that wouldn't come with shouting or spectacle. It would come with a question so simple, and a fact so undeniable, that there would be nowhere left for him to hide. And when that moment arrived, the word untouchable would stop meaning anything at all. To understand why Epstein sat so calmly in that courtroom, you have to understand the world that shaped him. Jeffrey Epstein did not build his confidence on innocence. He built it on insulation. Wealth was the foundation, but it was never just about money. It was about what money created: distance. Distance from consequences. Distance from scrutiny. Distance from the kinds of rules that applied to everyone else. Over time, that distance became a lifestyle. Private planes instead of public terminals. Private meetings instead of public records. Settlements instead of trials. Problems didn't vanish. They were absorbed quietly, buried under paperwork and non-disclosure agreements. Every challenge he faced ended the same way, with him walking away intact and someone else signing something that ensured silence. But the real power wasn't his bank account. It was his connections. Epstein learned early that influence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it sits beside you at a dinner table. Sometimes it answers your call before you even ask the question. When people saw the names he moved around, the doors he walked through, and the institutions that seemed willing to look the other way, a message spread without ever being spoken out loud. This is not a man you challenge. And that message worked. Lawyers hesitated. Witnesses reconsidered. Potential plaintiffs backed away before filing anything at all. Not because the truth wasn't there, but because the cost of telling it felt too high. Epstein didn't need to threaten people directly. The system did it for him. Careers could stall. Reputations could be questioned. Resources could dry up. In a country that prides itself on justice, fear quietly did the work instead. That's how myths are built. Not with loud victories, but with repeated silence. Each time Epstein avoided real consequences, the legend grew. Untouchable didn't mean innocent. It meant protected. It meant surrounded by layers of complexity so thick that most people never bothered trying to cut through them. And the longer that myth survived, the more confident he became. By the time this case reached a courtroom, Epstein wasn't just defending himself against allegations, he was defending the idea that he could even be questioned at all. He walked in believing the system would behave the way it always had. Delay. Minimize. Deflect. Settle quietly. Move on. What he didn't account for was the one variable that never shows up in his world. Someone who doesn't need him. That's the difference with Judge Judy. She doesn't rely on donors. She doesn't owe favors. She doesn't gain anything from being impressed. Status has no weight in her courtroom because it has no relevance to facts. Titles don't answer questions. Connections don't explain contradictions. And money doesn't rewrite timelines. Where Epstein's power thrived on complexity, Judge Judy thrives on patterns. She doesn't chase grand narratives. She watches behavior. She listens for repetition. She tracks what stays consistent when the story starts shifting. And in cases involving powerful people, she knows one thing better than most. Those who believe they're untouchable almost always make the same mistake. They assume they're being judged for who they are, not for what they did. That assumption makes them careless. Epstein believed his reputation would intimidate the room before evidence ever mattered. He believed the weight of his name would tilt the balance automatically. But Judge Judy wasn't interested in his name. She was interested in what followed it. Dates. Documents. Sequences. Choices. Patterns that didn't align with coincidence. And while Epstein sat there confident that history was on his side, Judge Judy was quietly measuring something else entirely. The gap between the story he told and the reality he left behind. That gap is where power usually hides. And it's also where it collapses. Epstein had no idea he was about to be judged by someone who couldn't be influenced. The case itself was quiet. No shouting headlines. No spectacle. Just a civil complaint that, on paper, looked almost modest compared to the legend surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. That alone was unusual. People expected chaos when his name appeared on a docket. Something explosive, something dramatic. Instead, what arrived in this courtroom was a story built from pressure, paperwork, and patience. The kind of case that shouldn't exist if power worked the way Epstein believed it did. At its core, the complaint wasn't about force. It was about leverage. About how money can speak louder than fear when it's offered at the right moment, with the right conditions attached. The allegation was simple and devastating in its simplicity. That Epstein used his resources to intimidate financially, to create circumstances where silence felt safer than truth. Not by threats shouted aloud, but by contracts slid across tables. Agreements written in careful language. Payments framed as assistance, settlement, closure. The imbalance was undeniable. On one side, a man with endless resources and legal teams prepared for every scenario. On the other, individuals with limited means, limited access, and limited options. People who were told, sometimes directly, sometimes subtly, that fighting would cost more than accepting what was being offered. And that once the paper was signed, the story would be over. That's how silence was bought. Not all at once, but piece by piece. What made this case different wasn't the accusation itself. It was the refusal to let it disappear. Someone had chosen not to walk away. Someone had chosen to say that contracts signed under pressure are not always consent, and that money offered in moments of vulnerability can become a weapon rather than a remedy. There were no dramatic claims here, no exaggerated language. Just documents. Timelines. Transactions that told a story without ever raising their voice. Throughout it all, the victim was presented with restraint and dignity. No sensationalism. No emotional theatrics. Just a steady account of how choices narrow when power is uneven, and how voluntary agreements can stop feeling voluntary when one side controls all the exits. The story didn't ask for sympathy. It asked for understanding. Epstein, meanwhile, seemed almost relieved. This was familiar territory. Civil court. Paperwork. Language he knew how to navigate. He spoke comfortably through his attorney, framing every action as standard practice. Settlements were common. Agreements were mutual. Everything he said had been handled properly and legally. He spoke as if legality and fairness were interchangeable concepts. And for a moment, it looked like the room might accept that framing. But Judge Judy wasn't reacting. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't challenging him yet. She sat quietly, pen moving across her notepad, eyes steady. Letting the words land. Letting the explanation stretch. Letting Epstein define his own logic in his own voice. That silence was deliberate. Judge Judy has seen this kind of case before. Not the names, not the scale, but the structure. She knows that when powerful people explain themselves, they often reveal more than they realize. Not in what they deny, but in what they normalize. What they assume everyone else will accept. What they think doesn't require justification at all. Epstein talked about efficiency. About avoiding unnecessary conflict. About how settlements help everyone move on. He spoke as though the absence of a courtroom fight proved fairness, as though quiet endings meant clean hands. And the longer he talked, the clearer the pattern became. Money appeared at moments of pressure. Agreements appeared at moments of fear. Silence followed every time. Judge Judy didn't challenge him yet. She didn't need to. She was mapping the pattern. Matching dates. Watching how often the same explanation surfaced. Noticing where details blurred and where they sharpened. Power leaves fingerprints even when it tries to wear gloves. What Epstein didn't realize was that by explaining himself so freely, he was doing the hardest part for her. He was laying out the framework of control he believed was normal. He was confirming the imbalance. He was turning a collection of documents into a narrative of intent. And while Epstein thought he was controlling the room, guiding the conversation, shaping the meaning of every choice, Judge Judy was letting him talk himself into something far worse. The shift was almost invisible at first. No raised voice. No dramatic pause. Just a change in rhythm. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly and asked her first question. It wasn't clever. It wasn't complex. It was the kind of question that sounds harmless until you realize it leaves no room to hide. Yes or no? The courtroom stilled. Jeffrey Epstein glanced at his attorney, then answered, but not really. He added context. He qualified. He explained why the question itself was incomplete. It was a practiced move, one he had used countless times before. When clarity becomes dangerous, complexity feels like safety. Judge Judy didn't react. She waited until he finished. Answer what I asked. Again simple. Again calm. And again Epstein avoided the direct answer. He wrapped his response in legal language, invoking standard practices and industry norms, speaking as though the law itself were a fog that could blur sharp edges. He sounded confident doing it. Almost relieved. This was his territory. Judge Judy let him go on just long enough for the pattern to settle in the room. Then she asked the question again, slower this time. Each word separated. Each syllable deliberate. It wasn't impatience. It was precision. She wasn't looking for information. She was testing control. Yes. Or no. Epstein smiled faintly and tried again. He reframed. He spoke about intent. He spoke about fairness. He spoke about how things are usually done. But he still didn't answer. Not directly. Not cleanly. That's when Judge Judy interrupted him. Not harshly. Not angrily. Just enough to stop the flow. To remind him who decided when answers were finished. Sir, she said evenly, I didn't ask you for a speech. The room shifted. Epstein straightened slightly in his chair. His lawyer leaned in, whispering. For the first time there was a hint of tension. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The kind that comes when someone realizes the rules might be different here. Judge Judy moved on to the next question. Just as simple. Just as narrow. Dates. Sequences. Order of events. Epstein answered this one, partially. Then added commentary. Then justification. Then a reminder of how complicated these situations can be. Judge Judy stopped him again. Answer the question. This time there was no smile. Epstein's voice remained steady, but his pace changed. He slowed down. Chose words more carefully. The confidence was still there, but it was working harder now. Like a mask being held in place by effort rather than ease. What Epstein didn't realize was that the trap wasn't a single question. It was the repetition. Every dodge highlighted the same thing. Every explanation added weight to the pattern Judge Judy was building silently in her notes. She wasn't reacting emotionally because she didn't need to. The answers were doing the work for her. She asked about agreements. He talked about mutual benefit. She asked about timing. He He talked about coincidence. She asked about money. He talked about generosity. Each response drifted just far enough from the question to reveal intent without admitting it. Judge Judy adjusted her approach. She repeated questions word for word. Same tone. Same posture. No escalation. The only thing changing was Epstein. He began to look down more often. Began checking with his attorney before speaking. Began to pause mid-sentence, as if realizing halfway through that what he was about to say might not land the way he expected. And still he believed he was managing it. From the outside it might have looked like a calm exchange. No shouting. No objections. But anyone watching closely could feel it tightening. Like a wire being pulled one notch at a time. Epstein thought he was winning because nothing had exploded yet. He mistook silence for safety. Judge Judy, meanwhile, had stopped taking notes. That's the moment that matters. When a judge stops writing, it's not because they're out of questions. It's because they've heard enough. She looked at Epstein and asked one more question, shorter than all the others. Clear. Impossible to misinterpret. Epstein opened his mouth to explain. Judge Judy raised her hand. Yes. Or no. The pause that followed was longer than any answer he had given. The courtroom waited. His attorney leaned closer. Epstein swallowed, eyes flicking back to the bench. For the first time there was no safe path forward, only truth or exposure. And in that silence, it became clear to everyone watching. He thought he was winning, but he was already exposed. The disaster hadn't arrived yet. But it was standing just outside the door waiting for him to speak. The silence didn't break him right away. It tempted him. After that long pause, Jeffrey Epstein leaned back slightly as if resetting himself. The hesitation faded. The confidence returned, not as smooth as before but sharper. Defensive confidence. The kind that believes pressure can still be pushed away if you push back harder. He began to speak again, this time with a subtle shift in tone. Less explanation. More dismissal. He suggested, carefully at first, that the case was being blown out of proportion. That civil disputes like this were common. That the courtroom was being asked to resolve something that had already been handled privately. Settlements had been reached. Agreements signed. He framed it as a misunderstanding, a technical disagreement dressed up as something more serious than it deserved to be. Then he crossed the line. Without saying it outright, he implied what he had always believed, that courts like this were not where people like him lost. That this was procedural theater. That the real decisions, the ones that mattered, were made elsewhere. He spoke as though this room was a formality, not a reckoning. As though the outcome had limits set by his status before anyone ever sat down. The air changed immediately. You could feel it in the way the room stopped moving. No shifting chairs. No rustling papers. Even Epstein's attorney went still. This wasn't just arrogance anymore. This was exposure. He had said the quiet part out loud, not in words but in meaning. Judge Judy didn't interrupt him. She let him finish. That's what made it worse. She waited until his last sentence settled, until the implication had nowhere left to hide. Then she looked directly at him. No anger. No sarcasm. Just the kind of calm that signals something final is about to be said. This courtroom, she said evenly, doesn't recognize status, only truth. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They cut through the room with precision. In that moment, Epstein's entire posture shifted. His shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened. He glanced at his attorney again, but this time there was no reassurance waiting for him. No whispered strategy. Just reality catching up. Judge Judy continued, her voice steady, her pace unhurried. You don't get special rules because of who you are, she said. You don't get different standards because of what you own. And you don't get to decide which courts matter. The confidence drained from Epstein's face, not all at once but enough for everyone to see it happening. The myth he had relied on for years was cracking in real time. The belief that power could insulate him from consequence no longer fit the room he was in. For the first time he tried to backtrack. He clarified. He softened. He suggested he had been misunderstood. But Judge Judy didn't follow him there. She had already marked the moment. She had already seen what mattered most. When pressure arrived, he didn't defend the facts, he dismissed the forum. That's not a legal mistake. That's a character reveal. Judge Judy leaned forward slightly, hands folded now. The questions stopped. The explanations no longer mattered. Epstein had given her what she needed, not evidence but intent. He had confirmed that he believed the rules bent around him, and that belief had shaped every decision in front of her. This is the moment viewers wait for. The instant when arrogance stops being entertaining and becomes fatal. When the mask slips just enough to expose the thinking underneath. And once that thinking is visible, there's no undoing it. If you've ever wanted to see arrogance meet consequences, subscribe, because this is where everything turns. Epstein sat there, silent now, eyes fixed forward. The room didn't feel tense anymore. It felt decided. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She didn't need to. She had already stripped away the only thing Epstein believed protected him. Status was gone. Confidence was gone. All that remained were facts, and the truth he had just revealed about himself. And that truth was about to be tested in a way money couldn't fix. The room shifted again, but this time it wasn't subtle. Judge Judy reached for the file in front of her and opened it deliberately, as if turning a page she had already read. The tone changed from inquiry to accounting. This was no longer about what Epstein said. It was about what existed. She began with the financial records. Not summaries. Not interpretations. Originals. Transfers lined up by date. Amounts placed side by side. Patterns made visible simply by putting facts in order. As she read them aloud, the story told itself. Money moving at precise moments, arriving just after key events, always followed by silence. No commentary was needed. The timing did the talking. Across the room, Jeffrey Epstein stopped smiling. The easy confidence that had carried him through the earlier questioning disappeared. His hands came together on the table, fingers interlaced tightly. He watched Judge Judy now, not with dismissal but with calculation. He was trying to see where this was going. Then came the documents. Signed agreements. Identical clauses. Language repeated across different cases with only names and dates changed. Judge Judy didn't accuse. She compared. She placed one document next to another and asked a simple question about consistency. Epstein's attorney attempted to respond, but Judge Judy waved him off gently. "I'm asking him," she said. Epstein answered, but his voice had lost its rhythm. He claimed standardization. Efficiency. Common practice. Judge Judy nodded once and turned the page. "That explanation would make sense," she said, "if the dates lined up the way you're suggesting." She read the first date aloud. Then the second. Then the third. Each one followed the same pattern. Complaint raised, money transferred, agreement signed. Over and over. Not coincidence. Sequence. Epstein shifted in his chair. His shoulders sagged slightly as if gravity had increased. The myth of chaos he relied on, the idea that complexity could hide intent, was evaporating under the weight of order. Judge Judy moved on to contradictions. Statements Epstein had made earlier in the hearing were now placed against the documents themselves. Where he said one thing happened after, the records showed it happened before. Where he suggested a choice was voluntary, the timeline showed pressure. Each contradiction was addressed calmly, without accusation, as if she were correcting a ledger rather than dismantling a defense. Epstein tried to respond. Tried to clarify. But each attempt only tightened the frame. The room watched as his explanations grew shorter and less confident. The pauses between answers stretched longer. He looked to his attorney again, but there was nothing left to add. And then Judge Judy reached the detail she had noticed from the very beginning. The small thing. The ordinary thing. A signature. She held up one document, not dramatically, not triumphantly. Just enough for it to be seen. And she pointed to the date beneath the signature. "This agreement," she said, "was signed on this day." She looked up at Epstein. "And earlier, you testified that no funds were transferred until after this date." The courtroom held its breath. Judge Judy turned one more page and read the transaction date aloud. It preceded the signature. By several days. The lie wasn't loud. It didn't come with fireworks. It was quiet and devastating. One signature. One date. One statement that could no longer exist beside the facts. Epstein didn't answer right away. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes dropped to the table. The confidence was gone completely now. Not replaced with anger. Not replaced with defiance. Just absence. Judge Judy didn't press him. She didn't need to. She let the contradiction stand on its own, unchallenged and undeniable. "That," she said calmly, changes everything. The myth of untouchable didn't shatter. It dissolved. Slowly. Publicly. Irreversibly. Power had always protected Epstein by obscuring details. Here details had done the opposite. They had stripped him down to sequence, to record, to truth. By the time Judge Judy closed the file, the outcome felt inevitable. Epstein sat still, shoulders slumped, eyes unfocused. The man who had entered the courtroom believing himself insulated from consequence was gone. All that remained was a defendant, a record, and a truth that money could no longer outrun. The courtroom didn't feel tense anymore. It felt settled. The kind of quiet that comes after the truth has finished speaking. Judge Judy looked down at the record one last time, not searching for answers, but confirming what had already been made clear. When she spoke, her voice carried no drama, only finality. She delivered the judgment cleanly and directly. Maximum civil penalties. No reductions. No sympathy discounts. The numbers were precise, calculated to reflect not just the harm done, but the pattern behind it. This wasn't punishment for a single decision. It was accountability for a system of choices. The judgment included asset exposure language, clear, unmistakable terms that stripped away the comfort of hidden protections. What had been shielded by complexity was now subject to scrutiny. Judge Judy explained her reasoning calmly. She spoke about leverage. About how money, when used to silence rather than resolve, becomes coercion. About how contracts signed under pressure do not erase responsibility. Her words were not accusatory, they were instructional. This wasn't just a ruling for the parties in the room. It was a message to anyone who believed influence could replace integrity. She went further. Her language invited further accountability, not as a threat but as a consequence. Records mattered. Patterns mattered. When one case reveals a structure, it opens doors. Justice doesn't end at a verdict, it begins there. The courtroom understood exactly what that meant. Across the room, Jeffrey Epstein sat motionless. The man who once leaned back with certainty now stared forward, unmoving. No smile. No whispering to counsel. No confidence left to project. Power had abandoned him the moment facts took the lead. When the ruling concluded, Epstein stood slowly. He didn't look toward the bench. He didn't scan the room. He gathered his papers with hands that moved carefully, deliberately, like someone relearning how to exist without protection. The exits that once opened easily now felt heavy. There was no entourage of assurance, no invisible shield of status. Just a man leaving a room where his myth had ended. The impact didn't stop at the door. What Judge Judy had done wasn't loud, but it was lasting. The ruling reframed the story from one of individual misbehavior to systemic misuse of power. It validated the idea that silence isn't neutrality, it's a resource that can be exploited. And when silence breaks, truth doesn't whisper. It documents. This case became a reference point not because of the name attached to it, but because of the clarity it delivered. It showed how patterns are built, how leverage hides in plain sight, and how accountability arrives when someone refuses to accept. That's just how it works. The legacy wasn't Epstein's downfall alone. It was the reminder that justice doesn't need spectacle to be effective. It needs patience. It needs precision. And it needs the courage to look at details others overlook. Power survives in silence. Justice begins when someone finally speaks. If you believe justice should be blind, blind to money, blind to status, blind to fear, comment, and no one is above the law. And subscribe for stories where power always meets accountability.